Hi, my name is Zachary Domach, and I'm a preceptor for Literature Humanities. Today I'd like to share with you an asynchronous approach to online discussions called the starter wrapper technique. I'll begin by contextualizing why I employ this approach and then move into a more detailed breakdown of all that it entails. In my original version of this class, I had weekly reading responses on Canvas, but then March 2020 happened, the pandemic, and my students were abruptly scattered and isolated. I wanted to maintain the community that we had built while also accommodating their new time zones and sleeping schedules. I had students in locations that ranged from Hawaii to Turkey to South Korea. My solution was to split the class in two. It now met at two different times, with roughly 11 students in each section. And classes now met for half the time because I wasn't about to teach twice the amount. And to make up for that lost time in class, I changed their weekly discussion responses to a more elaborate, asynchronous, interactive discussion board. And there were two of these, one corresponding to each section. My main goals here were to ensure that none of my students were in class at 4 a.m. at their local time, and also to reduce Zoom fatigue, to increase focus with the shorter class time. The online discussions were honestly an afterthought to those primary goals. So I was very surprised when on the last day of class, I asked my students about the course and their experience, and many of them cited the new discussion format as crucial to their success during the pandemic. This was also reflected in responses to a course evaluation that I designed and distributed. I'll let my students' voices speak for themselves here. So I asked the question, what has been most helpful for your learning in this course? One student replied, I really enjoyed learning how to respond back to my peers' arguments and discussions through Canvas. The discussion posts allowed me to incorporate my ideas thoroughly without being rushed to answer the question in class if I don't feel like I have to process the information I want to say thoroughly before my time is up. Another student said, definitely the discussion posts. It helped me to condense my thoughts into a smaller word count. Although sometimes I did struggle in writing them, the feedback was immensely helpful in allowing me to improve. A second question I asked was, what suggestions can you make for changes that would enhance your learning experience in this course? Here a student said, I think keeping the discussion post replies as a requirement would be helpful. I think being able to see other people's reading responses and the ways which they would engage and interpret the text would help me in my future reading responses. A second student said, I think there should be more discussion posts. Now, as I mentioned, these sorts of responses were totally unexpected, but since they were so positive, I determined to carry their advice into fall 2020. Like many instructors, I used part of summer 2020 to conduct a fair amount of research into online and remote learning. And while reading Michelle Miller's 2014 monograph, Minds Online, I encountered a footnote that mentioned something called the starter wrapper technique. Further research led me to several other studies on this method, and in its basic form, it's an online discussion in which one student acts as the starter and one as the wrapper. The starter poses a question or questions for discussion, and the wrapper summarizes the resulting conversation. There are more forms, more involved forms of this technique that introduce roles such as the devil's advocate. And I like the idea of roles, but I didn't see any need to go overboard with them in my class. So in my discussions, there are two moderators, in addition to one starter and one synthesizer. I renamed the wrapper as a synthesizer because I feel it more clearly communicates the skills I'm asking of my students. In my class, there are two parallel Canvas discussion threads each week. To keep the conversations focused and to reduce the number of posts my students need to read, each thread involves just half the class. So again, I'm kind of pulling this from the things that I did during the pandemic transition. Each week that one of my students does not have a discussion role, they are a participant and must post one original comment and at least two replies to their peers. That could be either to fellow participants or to one of the moderators. I asked that their original comments be 200 to 500 words. Last semester, I actually limited them to 300, but several of my students wanted to write more. So I said, okay, you can write as much as 500, but don't go beyond that because then the discussion boards will be too long and people won't read your posts. And the replies, I don't have a minimum word count on those. They can be made to a classmate's original response or to a previous reply. I just tell them it's insufficient to say something like, I disagree, and leave it at that. Of course, that's a great comment that has potential, but it needs expansion. The idea here, and this is what I stress, is to engage with the text and with the ideas of classmates. So let's go into a little more detail now about each of those roles. The starter is the person who opens the discussion thread, right? They ask critical questions or they pose relevant problems to the text. In short, the starter's job is to post contributions on which their peers can build. This role requires the starter to read ahead, and the starter also kind of keeps the discussion focused and on the right track. So they can offer clarification whenever necessary. For example, if one of the replies maybe is misunderstanding the discussion prompt, then there's the moderator. And there's actually two moderators. These people monitor the discussion. They ask critical questions. They can request others' perspectives, say something like, could you say more about that? In general, their job is to encourage participation. They might add new points into the discussions to reactivate conversation if discussions have slacked off. And then finally, there's the synthesizer. This person integrates the ideas posted by the group throughout the week and concludes the discussion by highlighting all new ideas, themes, solutions, and applications constructed throughout the discussion. I posted detailed guidelines on each of these roles, as well as a rotation schedule so students know when they have each role and responsibility. And that's all on Canvas. If a student has a discussion role, they're excused from regular participant responsibilities. But if they like, they're still welcome to contribute to the discussion as normal. And that's a change I made based on feedback from my students who felt that they couldn't participate in the discussion when they wanted to if they were, say, the starter or the synthesizer. So I made that explicit this semester. Here you can see on the screen a breakdown of the weekly discussion progression. The starter posts on Monday, students have a couple days to see what's up and then respond on Wednesday. The moderators then have their first round of responses. Then there's a second round of responses from the moderators, as well as the replies by the participants due on Saturday. And finally, on Sunday, the synthesizer summarizes the conversation. So I'd like to close now with some more of my students' voices, this time from an evaluation that I distributed at the end of fall 2020. So again, I asked, what has been most helpful for your learning in this course? One student said, the discussion posts have been the most helpful for my learning in this course. I was able to take more time to analyze the text, think critically, and formulate an opinion. I still think about previous discussion posts to this day and have even discussed some of the topics with friends, family, and other people outside of Columbia University. A second student said, the discussion posts were very helpful in diving deeper into certain parts of the text we were working with in class on a given week, and helped me feel more prepared to discuss in class after already writing how I may have interpreted something and seen how it compares to others in the class. A third student wrote that the online and class discussions have been most helpful. From others, I can learn new perspectives and then combine those with my own ideas to form something unique. Moreover, if I didn't understand something in the readings, I can always refer to the discussion posts to clear up any confusions. And finally, one comment from a fourth student. I think that the full class Zoom discussions have been most helpful for my learning overall, but I think it can only do that because it's not the only way of learning. I think the discussion board and the small class discussions give me a focus as to what I want to think about for the full class discussions. And then the full class discussions give me the opportunity to hear more perspectives than the smaller discussions, end quote. Now, what stands out to me the most when I read these comments is how students see the in-class discussions and the online discussions as counterparts which buttress one another. And that's how I see them too. My learning objectives for literature humanities involve the development of close reading, textual analysis, and seminar skills, and online discussions are fundamental to each of those.